Welcome to the Peace Country Historical Society podcast, where we blend community voices with historical expertise and talk about history in the Peace Country. From early settlers to modern trailblazers, we explore how history shapes our lives today. Subscribe to the Peace Country Historical Society podcast, where the past speaks and we listen.
Well, first of all, welcome to our second podcast. This one has a focus on a local institution, which involves so many people here, because it, like Total War does, World War I and II involves so many people, and in the aftermath, Korea and peacekeeping as well. So we're going to talk about the Legion and its contribution to the region, and with me is our guest today, Wanda Zenner, who's in the Peace Country History Society Board and has special interest in a tradition of activity within the Legion, and who knows more about the Legions here than I do. So we'll start with the general history. Back in November 1925, so that's 6 years after the war really comes to an end, the Canadian Legion was founded in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The Legion was part of the British Empire Service League, which had been founded by General Haig, the British commander-in-chief at the end of World War I. And Earl Haig, as he was then, had made a trip to Canada and had committed to the idea, which many Canadians also were deeply committed to, the idea of maintaining a fellowship and a comradeship after the war. You know, it was the biggest thing we'd ever done, and it was a world war. Although people got in trouble when they said the First World War, because everyone said, "You mean you think there's going to be a second?" And they said yes. But certainly what it meant was that starting in Winnipeg and then across Canada, Calgary, of course, their Legion was a very old one of the first. It grew steadily through the 30s. It had a major role to play during the royal visit of 1939. The Legion coordinated a lot of things here because they were the veterans who'd seen the war and who really had fought to make the world safer than it was turning out to be. Mm-hmm. Their commitment to the institutions they'd fought for and the country they'd fought for was recognized all across Canada and the Commonwealth. In 1960, after a major expansion after World War II, when we had 1.2 million people in uniform, for a country of 11 million, this was astounding. Nevertheless, it meant that the Legion became larger and larger. Queen Elizabeth gave it royal patronage in 1960, and that meant it was the Royal Canadian Legion from 1960 on. It's a commemoration. The Legion exists so that we never forget the sacrifices that were made, not just by the military, but by their families as well. Legion branches are actually cornerstones of community activity. And they provide the largest volunteer base in the country. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Right now, there's about 250,000 members in 1,350 branches across Canada. They ground us in the past, they serve us in the present, and they call us to remember the sacrifices and contributions in the future. So, obviously, the question for us is, what kind of contribution does the Legion make? What kind of footprint does it have in our region, Wanda?
Yes, well, thank you for having me, Duff. Yes, we certainly are very lucky to have a few local legions in our area. Perhaps the biggest one is the Grand Prairie Legion, number 54. It received its charter in 1927, and they actually held their meetings, their events in various venues around until they were able to actually have their own building where it is now in Grand Prairie.
Right.
And they call it is now known as the Lancaster. Something that I just figured out here this last while is that was named after the Lancaster bomber.
Right, exactly, yes.
Yes. And I mean, the building itself has gone over expansion and some renovations as well. They fixed up a lower lounge, and they have it's called now the Corvette room.
Oh, for the Navy.
Yes,
right.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that I found so interesting about the Grand Prairie Legion was that they formed this track and field club. Yes, and it was the traveling track, which I thought was very interesting.
Oh, interesting.
It was a wooden track, then it almost fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, or maybe one of those game things where it would come apart, so they could easily travel from city to city to city.
Wow.
And that was, that carried on for 15 or 16 years. And I was one of the ones that actually had ran on that track.
Good for
so
you.
I can tell you firsthand what it was all about.
What
yes.
was it like?
It was quite solid.
Okay, yeah. You're hard on the feet.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to have to make too many rounds around there for sure. But
right.
it always kind of amazed me that 2 trucks would pull in, and all of a sudden these pieces would be coming out
right.
and loaded up, and it would be moving on to the next large town or the city, and
wow.
the residents around that area then would be running on that
Weatherproof,
track. So
full of peace country ingenuity, I guess.
I think you would say
Yeah,
that.
Right.
But the Legion was certainly, Grand Prairie Legion was
good for
certainly
them.
very well known for that. So in 2020, with COVID, they thought it was a very good time to actually do some renovations. So the aging kitchen, they completely replaced that. They completely replaced the floor. And they are a very large organization. They have over 500 members.
Yeah.
Which is really quite amazing. And they're always busy over there. It really amazes me. There's always some draw to the community to come in, whether it's karaoke night or whether they're having a crib tournament, or even the large venues like funerals. And their funerals are just taken care of so well, and large events as weddings as well. And they also had Ladies Auxiliary that was formed in the 1950s, and it's still operating today. So that's probably the biggest one. And then if we move to the outside areas, we have the Hythe Legion that was formed in 1930, and they had decided in 1987 that they actually needed to have a hall and a lounge, and it really became a central point as well. And one thing that I found so interesting about them is every Friday night, volunteers have a supper that anybody can go to.
Okay.
Yes. So if that doesn't draw your community in, and so every Friday, whatever organization wants to put it on and have their volunteers do it, then yes, and then they get the funds from that.
Oh, wow.
But more importantly to me, Duff, I think, is that they have this wonderful Remembrance Day celebration. Where they're standing room only by the time, if you happen to get there right on time or a little bit late. It is absolutely remarkable. And they have pictures of their fallen. It's coming on a slideshow, and they're talking about it at the same time. And then they have this wonderful luncheon afterwards. And I'm not talking soup and sandwiches here. We're talking turkey and beef and potato, every salad that you can possibly imagine.
So what you're saying is the smaller the Legion, the more, the slideshow got me thinking, the smaller the Legion, the more focus there is on individuals.
Absolutely.
You want to remember everyone personally with a picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wow, that's impressive.
It was, and I will certainly be going back again. And they just all make you feel so welcome there. I mean, I'm an hour's drive away from there, but you thought I lived next door. The way you're treated when you walk in with your poppy
exactly.
scarf
You
on.
got your scarf on,
Yeah.
Well, people we know who were in the auxiliaries or even in some of the seminary, PRBI, Peace River Bible Institute, some of those guys were called up during national service. And I remember one guy who came out of Hythe was at PRBI and wanted to go as a chaplain. But they said, you haven't graduated yet.
Oh.
So he ended up being an Air Force auxiliary and home service. So for him, the Legion was a place where he was sort of there, but of course he hadn't gone overseas.
Right.
So to him, there was a pecking order. If you've been out in the big one, that you were elite,
Right,
But if
absolutely.
you've been a trainee, you might say, well, you were sort of just go there and mind yourself, behave yourself,
Yes.
What about Sexsmith?
Yes, and Sexsmith, they are Sexsmith Legion Branch number 60.
Okay.
They received their charter in 1928, and in 1937 they had they had finally got their cenotaph finished.
Okay.
And if you remember, Duff, the big radio station back in the day was CFGP.
Yes.
And they actually broadcast from out there at the cemetery that year. Yeah, so that was really quite impressive for them. And they are struggling a little bit with, as all legions seem to be, with getting the younger generation involved and increasing their membership. And they did have a ladies' auxiliary at one time, but that has been disbanded, unfortunately. And like I say, they're struggling a little bit, too.
But they sponsored cadets, didn't they? They had the Air Cadets for a few years in the 50s.
I believe so,
I think now the Sea Cadets are back housed there, I think, or in the region.
Well, and the one thing that I do like about Sexsmith, too, they have, what you can purchase what do they call their flags, and they have those of the veterans. They have them on their light posts going down their streets, So it's worth anybody around. Just to
Truly
go out.
preserving the connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just
Wow,
take a
good for
drive
you.
out there, It's, I guess perhaps I'm a bit of a visual person, but it seems like we can talk all about it. But if you show me a picture or if you see something
Yeah.
like that and you're looking at this young face that looks like he's 16 and, it really certainly hits
Yeah,
home.
wow. Now, the Legion you put a lot of your own personal commitment into was the West Smoky Legion.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
where is that?
No, that is located in Bezanson, the West Smoky Legion, number 244. And in 1949, when all the veterans were back, they were getting on with their families, getting on with their homes and their farms, they decided that it would be really advantageous if the community had a legion. So what they had done, they followed the model of the East Smoky Legion, which was in DeBolt.
Okay.
And I always chuckled about that. So the only thing they actually changed is what side of the river they were
Yeah,
on.
that's right. That's right.
Is what I decided. But if you can imagine, they were all very dedicated in the area. So with a loan of $500, they built their little building there. Because up until that point, they were holding their meetings and their events and wherever they could, like the Bezanson Log Hall was one. It burned down in 49, so they
Oops,
didn't have that anymore. So then P.G. Rooney, who had the store in what is now known as the Hamlet Bezanson, he allowed them to have their meetings upstairs. And then they finally got, their finances in order, and they took out this loan, and they built a little building.
Good for
and
them.
It's been affectionately called the Legion Hut. And so it was actually in 1952 is when it was. And in the early 50s, they had a wonderful community Christmas event. So they would start off with a family-friendly movie. And then they would go into, your Christmas oranges and your candy and your ice cream, all for adults and everything too. And that carried on for 10 years, if you can imagine.
Quite a party.
And what was happening, we were getting such an influx of people from outside of the area that we just couldn't handle it anymore.
Couldn't fit them all in, yeah.
Yeah, so as often the case that you will find all of a sudden it outgrows itself and you just can't do that anymore.
It's funny you mentioned the movies. I remember the Lions Club. By the way, I ran in Legion track meets back in
did you?
Ontario.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Back in the 70s. The Chemtrail Legion sponsored a track and field day for the Legion.
Did your track move too?
No, it was mud and gravel.
Oh.
And it was a long track. It wasn't metric. It was imperial. So we ran half of a mile. It was a horse track, I think, converted to people. But that's what you do, eh?
Oh,
but
absolutely.
the movies are interesting because I remember in the 60s, 70s playing hockey. And there was always a movie brought in, which was usually a comedy for the kids, Laurel and Hardy or something like that. Was that the kind of films that came in? Yeah, right. Family friendly, all right.
Family
but-
friendly, yeah.
But a good laugh for all ages, eh?
Totally, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the kids, they just absolutely love the ice cream, I'll tell you.
Yeah,
You can't
exactly.
go wrong. You want to entice kids in, just say, we have ice cream, it's
You
going
got
your
it.
way.
Yeah, not that common in everyday life in those days.
No,
either.
no, it was a treat then. It was
That's right,
absolutely
yeah.
a treat. And, the motto of our Legion is to really be focused on something that we can build in our community that will be there forever. And one of the best things is that they initiated a swimming program.
Oh, wow.
So we have sponsored and will continue to sponsor the swimming lessons, and we pay for the bus. So they come to a little Hamlet.
Yeah, because you don't have a pool in Bezanson, do you?
Besides the dugouts, no, we
No,
don't have
that's
those.
right. So you drive into Grand Prairie.
Right.
Oh, good for you.
Yes,
Yeah.
so it's wonderful. So, and the best part about that too, we're down to 3 generations now that have taken swimming lessons, of which I am one.
Yep.
So that tells you that I've been there for a while.
Well, but that's where the longitudinal service, as we say, the long term. So
Yes.
what you're saying is these folks come back. They want to be together with each other. Mm-hmm. It sounds like most of them have some kind of a lounge or bar because soldiers are not prohibitionists as a rule. And so the idea of getting together for some liquid fellowship is part of the comradeship.
Right.
But what really here is they want to be together. Is it kind of group therapy or community therapy?
I certainly would think it would
Yeah,
be.
yeah.
Absolutely. I would say this is their PTSD refuge.
Right.
Is to be able to go there, open up their hearts and their souls to others who have gone through the same thing.
Yeah.
Because even in my case, I found my dad, who was in World War II, he did not discuss, I was an only child, so he did not discuss much, if anything, with Mom and I.
Yeah.
It was almost as if he wanted to spare us of hearing the horror stories. But what I found really interesting is once my sons, I have 3 of them, once they were of age, he would discuss certain things with them.
Okay.
But, back in that day, you had to protect the women from
Interesting.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
no
he would
kidding.
go to these places as other veterans, and they all had the same experience. They all had seen the same horrors. So you could discuss that freely with them. And like you say, if there happened to be an odd drink involved, that was probably okay too.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think that could also serve as a liquid loosening for the tongue and
Yes.
opening of the heart. And I'm sure there were lots of cards games played. And other-
Absolutely,
yeah.
there was darts, and one of the things that we initiated after we didn't do the Christmas anymore that I thought was very interesting was what we called the Wild Game Supper.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
Right.
now
I've heard
this
of
was
that. Yeah.
this was something that was so unusual. I think that's why it was so popular. And in fact, as soon as those tickets were available, if you didn't get them, you wouldn't be getting in because people waited all year for this. So we had very interesting meats. There was moose and deer and elk and muskrat and squirrel and and there was even a little bit of llama thrown in one year. They had rattlesnake. Yes, it was.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, prairie chicken and partridge make the best meat pies.
Yeah.
There's just absolutely best. So it's just about any meat that you probably can think of.
Culinary adventurism. That's what we're talking about here.
It was,
Wow.
absolutely.
Wow.
And another thing that our little legion was really quite famous for, and it was the annual turkey shoot.
With real guns?
Absolutely.
You're
yes.
kidding.
Yes, in the basement.
In the basement?
In the basement, yes. But one Legion member told me, but it was okay because they only used shorts, 22
Yeah,
shorts.
shorts. Yeah, low energy. But yeah, a long rifle would have gone right through the back wall.
Well, you would have thought so. Even
Yeah,
the thought of
wow.
it now, I think, oh my goodness, that was pretty adventurous,
Yeah.
to be actually shooting. And it was interesting to see how the members and the neighbors would actually become quite competitive in their shooting skills. And what I always chuckle at, though, is that some of the women would actually come forward too and prove to be very competent. Because I remember my mother bringing home a turkey one year.
There you go.
Yeah, so she certainly hit that bullseye a few times
No
to bring
kidding.
that turkey home.
Yeah, wow.
But the Legion really has, it is one of the cornerstones of our community. And I mean, we had started off with, I believe it was around 60 members. By the 70s, we had dropped down to 36. And right now we're kind of stabilizing at 34, 35. But it was, there were anniversary parties were held, there were birthday parties, just any kind of a little celebration that you could think of. And unfortunately, and I think this is one of the, for all Legion, is trying to get the next generation to kind of come in and fill this bit of a void as some of us are getting a little bit old here. But, and we certainly are hoping now, we are planning on renovating our kitchen in the spring of 2024.
Right.
And I mean, certain things weren't perhaps done up just quite right back in the day because they had put an addition on in 77, 78. Washrooms, inside washrooms, and a kitchen area in a large central area. And we have since found, the electrical isn't quite up to code and the plumbing isn't quite up to code. So we're wanting to get all that taken care of in the spring, and I think what that's happened, it'll, initiate some of the other groups wanting to use it again a little bit more.
Exactly. Yeah. The
So,
community facility function is really important in these little towns, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And another thing that we take very seriously, too, with our Legion was actually trying to educate the youth. And this is where I believe that we can do great good, is educating the youth. Now, grade 6 class at the Wisconsin School, they are learning about the government.
Oh, yeah.
So they always come over that week. We call it Remembrance Week. And this year, we were very fortunate to have the executive director from the Veterans Memorial Gardens. And she has this wonderful kit with artifacts and medals and things. And she went through that with all the kids. And she had actually brought out hats so they could wear military hats and T-shirts. And the funniest to me, anyway, was the camouflage paint that she brought along.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, some of these mothers, I wonder what they're going to think when the kids come home. But the kids absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
And one thing that really impressed me too, Duff, was, so she had played O Canada to start with. And 2 of these little boys actually stood up and took their hats off, and I think, yes, we are making a bit of a difference here.
Yep.
And so we really believe that we need to carry on with that, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think that what I'm hearing, though, is the Legion is not a pro-war institution,
No.
which many people, I think, used to think that. In
You're
the
probably
anti-war
right,
60s
yeah.
and 70s, there was this feeling the Legion was this antiquated bunch of old war lovers reminiscing about their glory days.
Yes.
But it's not, is it?
No, by no stretch of the imagination, that's for sure. And, we try to look after our community as well. We do provide a bursary for a student at NWP if they've gone to Grand Prairie and then gone on. So we provide a bursary there. We actually, if somebody has something devastating happen to them, like a house fire, we donate there. Same thing with medical. If you have to go out of town for medical, we're there.
Neat.
But, basically any kind of an emergency like that, your Legion is there to help you. Unfortunately, things happen in life, so there's another Legion member, she and I will actually go around and we visit them, bring them some little goodies or whatever, and just let them know that we're here. Like, we're here if you need to talk, we're here. We'll go grocery shopping for you. We'll, anything
Good
like
for
that
you.
that we
Yeah.
possibly can help you
Right.
with. Yes, absolutely.
Right. So they become a rallying point for the community
Absolutely,
as well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
And we
fascinating.
certainly contribute to the local community groups. Now, the Byzantium Playground Committee. So, of course, the school was built in 57, and the playground has barely had any updates since then. So, a group got together, and they were trying to raise money for that. So, we donated $10,000 to them so they could make everything all safe for the students over at the school. And certainly, the Byzantium Recreational Society, the Byzantium Golden Years Club,
Okay, right.
the school, all of those have benefited. And in fact, the Ag Society has benefited greatly from donations from the Legion to ensure that it's still a viable entity, that's for sure.
So the agricultural fair or shows would have Legion backing as well. Uh-huh. Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's great.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, they all take part in the annual poster and literary
okay, I was wondering about that.
contest, yes.
Yeah.
And we've actually been lucky enough. We've had some that actually have won at the provincial level.
Yeah.
So, the talent out there just really amazes me, and especially with the poster stuff, because I can't draw at all. So when I'm looking at what a grade 3
Yeah.
could draw, it just amazes me.
Well, the Legion magazine, which is a
Yes.
national publication, I used to recommend, and I still will to my students, as one of the best places to pick up Canadian military history as they focus on different themes.
Yes.
For many years, the columns by Terry Kopp on history of each of the battles.
Oh,
There's one for
yes.
the Air Force, one for the Navy. If you pick up an old Legionary magazine, you'll see, in fact, the properly, professionally done history. And today's Legion magazine still has historical themes that involve all kinds of things, women, Native people. It's still one of the best easily acquired history collections of Canadian military
Isn't
history out
right?
of the experience of the veterans. And then at the back, all their community service, photographs of all the scholarships, the track meets.
Right.
So that idea of a history of commemoration and public service
Right.
is in every edition of that magazine.
Oh,
You'll often
interesting.
see people, I'm wondering if we went back looking, we might even find a picture of the Byzantium, essay writers in there somewhere.
Oh, wouldn't that be interesting?
So they become
Yes.
a kind of a chronicle
Right.
of military history that Canadians were involved in and their contemporary service as well
Yes.
along the way. So it's a magazine, I used to go into the news magazine store here in town,
Yes.
and pick one up if I didn't have a subscription. For
Right.
just that reason, I could take it to my students and say, here, look at this
Oh,
article on,
right.
on whatever, or
Yes.
Tona or something like
Yes.
that. So that's important. But it also means that the commemoration of individuals means you have to tell their stories.
Mm-hmm.
So who are some of the people that are featured in the story of the Legion and their military service?
Oh, absolutely. Now, a few years ago, I do believe it was 2018, 2019, what we had decided to do as a Legion, we wanted to commemorate all of those fallen from
Right,
our area.
exactly.
So we had 9 from our area, 4 in World War I and 5 in World War II. And so we had partnered with the Canadian Fallen Heroes Foundation.
right.
And the whole purpose was to put a face to the fallen, have a little bit of insight into their lives, and commemorate them by the means of these plaques. And these plaques are just absolutely wonderful, Duff. They have a picture of it and then a brief biography. And so I helped out a great deal with these. And what I had wanted was a photo on it that represented the area in which they lost their lives.
Oh, okay, a map or something.
Yeah. Well, it is, like the Sangro River, for example,
Yeah,
one that,
right.
yeah, so there would be a picture of tanks rolling along
Yeah,
there.
right.
And it really quite brings it home.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. This really happened.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
So Private Alexander Brothardson, this would be the World War I.
Okay.
He was actually from Scotland, if you can imagine,
Oh.
and came all the way over to Canada and ended up in Edmonton, where he found work at a cartridge company. And who does he run into there but A.M. Bazanson, who just happened to be there selling lots at his
Yes,
town
promoting
site.
his town, yeah.
Promoting his town, absolutely. Now, Alexander was a harness maker by trade. So, I mean, what does every town site need? They had a harness maker. Because what I was told, that was like your garage
Yes,
back in the
yeah,
day.
that's
It was
right,
like your garage.
yeah.
So it was the only one around. So he did really, really well.
Yeah.
And then, then the war happens. And I believe with him, it was just that true sense of patriotism that made him a list, because he had a very viable business.
Yeah.
That was doing really well. So, in 1915, he enlisted and he went overseas. And he had actually, part of his letter, I will just read for you. I have just returned to the rest camp after doing a 13-day trip in the trenches. I spent both Christmas and New Year's in them and expect to return to them very soon. Now, he lost his life during the Suchez River campaign, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Suchet, yep.
And he is commemorated on the Vimy Memorial, and he was only 27 years old. Now, of those that are quite familiar with the Vimy Memorial, when there's no body to be found, and they know they were in this battle, of course, then their names actually get listed on this Vimy Memorial. And the Vimy is just, it's unbelievable to see a picture of that.
Suchet is just north of the monument. So it's
is
in the
that
Vimy
right?
Ridge zone. Yes,
Yeah.
it's probably where the hills are steepest and where there was a lot of gas used. And so in Suchet, there's been so much fighting that even the French don't know everyone who passed away in that area. So it's a really historically a murderous place to have been overseas.
Yes.
So that would have probably put him in the 4th Division in that area. And but Scots, they always have this idea that when there's a war, they have to join up.
Is that
Call
right?
to the colors,
Yeah.
it's bred in the blood, they say, And so I think for my family, who were at the other end of the country, same thing,
Right.
And of course, to try and get into a regiment and get over there to serve under the old flag for king and country was a deep tradition that
Yes.
everyone was expected to send somebody.
I think so.
For Robertson to go, was he married? Do you know it offhand, or was
No,
he?
he
not
wasn't
sure?
married.
Okay, right.
No.
Okay, easier for them than perhaps
Yes.
others, but for him, over you go. And
Yes.
wow.
Well, like he wasn't even over here all that long, and then the war happens, and war is
Back they
declared,
go.
and he's off again, and so we do believe that when he left, he actually had Mr. Dewhurst look after his, and a lot of people remember it as the Dewhurst harness shop, but indeed he was just managing it. Maybe he bought it from the estate. I'm not
You
sure.
could- it's interesting. You see wartime wills sometimes sketched on a piece of paper
yes.
saying, "I confer all this." So that could also be part of it. Maybe he willed it to Dewhurst. Who knows?
And he may have, but
Yeah.
did you see most of them? It was always their mother.
Yeah. Oh,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
The single guys, it's always mother.
The mom, yeah.
And when they're in the hospitals, it's often who they're in their sleep they're calling for is their mother.
Goodness, just the thought of that
Yeah,
tears at your heart.
No, it does. And
Yeah.
so you see then the need. There had to be a ladies' auxiliary.
Yes.
There had to be a way for in World War I to commit that kind of support. And then, of course, in World War II, there were many women who served in uniform.
Yes, there were.
World
Yes.
War I, it was just the nurses. But in
Yep.
World War II, there was a wide variety of women's services.
Right.
And they would be veterans, too.
Yes. That's
Yeah.
pretty amazing. Another young fellow from the area was Private Cecil Evans, and he came with his stepfather from Ottawa area, if you could imagine. They had a cattle operation, would you call it that? A milking dairy.
Dairy was big in Ottawa.
Dairy,
Yeah.
yes. And who had been down in Ottawa but A.M. Bazanson? He was down there promoting his new wheat that would grow up here. And so he was looking for somebody to look after his cattle, manage his cattle down
Okay.
here at the town site.
Right.
He runs into Sidney Webb, which is Cecil Evans' stepfather,
Okay.
convinces to enter into a partnership. And so the two of them, Sidney and his stepson, I think he was like 16 at the time or something, Cecil, he heads out. Well, so he's managing this cattle operation. Well, Maynard Besançon soon realizes he needs their help more in the development of the town site. So he calls them in to work on that. In fact, Cecil was the first postmaster in the area in 1914. And then 1915, the same time as Alexander Brothard's son, he enlists as well. And he heads overseas. Another one of the things that I've actually heard, Duff, is that a lot of them were looking for, the younger ones especially, they were looking for adventure.
Yeah, of course.
And I truly believe that this is what Cecil was looking for, just by a letter that he had wrote home.
Right.
Part of which was actually published in the Grand Prairie Herald. We had a very pleasant trip across the pond and find much pleasure in visiting these different historic and romantic cities of England. We sailed on the Olympic from Halifax to Liverpool. The Olympic is certainly a most wonderful ship and deserves the name of Floating Palace. She is very well built and has a capacity of over 48,000 tons. There were 7,000 all told aboard, but she has had 13,000 at one time. From Liverpool, we had an 8-hour journey by rail to our camp, which is situated on a hill at the little village called Otterpool.
Yep.
About 53 miles from London and 7 miles from Shorncliffe, the regular army barracks. We are living in tents, but enjoy the camp life in England really quite well. Now, who in a war write such romantic thoughts about where they were actually staying?
Well, he is still training, and he's still in the rear area,
Yes, yes.
It's interesting. 1915 was the big volunteer year for Alberta. Probably more volunteers in 1915 than in 16. And so the challenge in 1915 that a lot of planners for the military in Canada realized was a lot of the volunteer pool of people that would go was used up in 1915.
Oh, okay.
So they get over there and train, and then in 1916, the heavy fighting and the high casualties really bite. And that's when a lot of these guys who thought it was going to be over by Christmas or
Yes.
be a romantic adventure discovered that they were in for the long haul, and it was a murderous affair.
Well, it was
So
that,
for a lot of
indeed.
these guys who volunteered in 15, died in 16 or 17.
Well, and that's exactly what happened here. Private Cecil Evans, he lost his life in the offensive towards Courcelette.
yeah,
And he's
1916.
another one, the body wasn't found. And the thought of that I know the War Graves Commission is doing a fantastic job of trying to actually, find out certain remains and what have you. But you have to keep in mind as well, with all the bombing and things going on, there might have been no remains left at all. And
Well,
that
that's the
thought
thing.
just-
I've been to Courcelette and seen the cemeteries there. In fact,
Yeah.
the Peace Country guy got a Victoria Cross just down the road from Courcelette. Kerr, George Chipman Kerr,
Oh, yes.
from Spirit River,
Yes.
ran the Dunvegan Ferry and then walked all the way down to get the train to join up. But these are the guys who get over there. And of course, the shelling was so intense that when we were there visiting with my students 10 years ago, we were still seeing little bones coming out of the
Is
ground.
that
and
right?
pieces of shell and ammunition. They still find live ammunition on the
Yes.
field. The farmers, they're doing their plowing. And so the French Engineer Corps comes along, picks them up, and trucks them off to be destroyed. It is true. I mean, the shelling was so intense. And
Yes.
Courcelette, that area was fought over continuously for 6 months. And in all the rain and mud, it was possible simply just to disappear.
Right.
Known
Yeah.
only to God is often on the headstone. One of the headstone epitaphs they put
Yeah,
out that families could choose from.
Is that right?
No, it was a murderous battlefield.
Oh, the pictures are horrendous, Yeah, so, Cecil left in July of 15 and he lost his life September of 16.
Yep.
So, I mean, he was gone a year and a couple of months. It was just, it was really something. And of course, he's commemorated on the Vimy Memorial as well.
Yes.
And he was 22.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah. And then we have Corporal Willis Johnston. Now, they had come from Ontario out to Alberta with this idea of, $10 got you 160 acres of land. But nobody told them out here, I think, what the winters were like.
Yeah, surprise. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, Willis was another one. He was recruited by the 101st Fusiliers in Edmonton.
Yes, Edmonton, yep.
And he was sent directly to Valcartier.
Valcartier,
yeah.
yep.
And then he was one of the ones that sailed on the SS Zealand Now, 33 Atlantic liners carried the contingent of 33,000
That's the
men.
first contingent, yep.
Wouldn't that have been something to see them all lined up and just the thought of them?
One convoy, yep. My
Yeah.
grandfather's brother was on that shipment.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, you can tell by the service number. If it's under 33,000, their personal
Makes
number,
sense,
they're the first
yes.
33,000, yeah.
Yeah,
The first
his
contingent.
was 18208.
Exactly,
Yeah.
there you go, yeah.
Yeah, for
Oh,
heaven's sake.
just a couple numbers down from my great uncle.
Is that right?
It is, yeah. Now, the 101st was a local militia battalion that filled up with men and then sent them down to Valcartier, and then they ended up in different regiments than they started in. So you
Right.
probably ended up in, the 49th, which was Edmonton, or
Yeah.
the 10th, which was Calgary.
Yeah.
But it probably ended up, not where he started in the 101st. They never actually went.
Right.
But they shipped over,
Right.
recruited and then shipped over dozens of these guys.
Okay.
So yeah, imagine. And Courcelette, it's a flat battlefield. There's little rolling hills.
Yeah.
And so when the Canadians capture the village, if they go beyond it, they get up in these little hills and they come down, and they're a sitting duck
Makes
for the
sense,
German trenches at the bottom of the hills, right?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it was a lethal place to be.
Wow.
Yeah.
I would say that's for sure. And that's when he was transferred to France. He became part of the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps,
Okay. Right.
which is so important, because they are the ones that look after the CEF, and they're responsible for the transportation of
Mm.
food, clothing, materials, weapons,
Yep.
bridge parts, and everything.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And then, of course, you're going to have some sad moments as well, too, because this happens to be my great uncle. And, you survived the war. And then there was this flu that was going around.
Oh, yes.
Called the Spanish flu
Yes.
in 1819. And I really believe it was the close troop quarters
Yep.
that really made this spread like wildfire.
Yep.
And it was listed in his service file that he was dangerously ill, and 3 days later he was dead.
gone. Yep.
So he passed away January 3rd of 1919 before he
Even got home.
he could get back home. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's buried in the St. Jan Communal Cemetery in Belgium.
Yep.
And I understand that area was actually under German control at one time.
Yes. Then
Yeah.
was pushed back and then became a
Yeah.
cemetery area.
Yeah.
So we're talking about here the way in which the military cooped up for those 6 months after the war, became
Yes.
an incubation zone. And when they were
Yes.
sent back to Canada, they brought it with them.
They did,
Yeah, a
yes.
very common effect. What about World War II veterans? How did
Well,
they?
World War
fare?
II, we had 5 of the World War II, and I'll start with the first one, Sergeant Charles Dorscheit. Now, he had actually moved from Minnesota with his
Yeah,
family,
right.
and they settled in an area of Besançon known as Glen Leslie. And, they were farming and doing really quite well, expanding their farms. He had actually married and had a daughter, and then he felt the need to go overseas as well. And he joined the Royal Armored Division. And so he was actually involved in the Normandy invasion. And they had captured Caen, and they had moved on to the Fillet Pocket, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yep.
And they had actually... they had actually done very well there, and 2 days they were just having a bit of a rest camp, and he was actually hit by a single shot,
Yep.
if you can imagine, and he died instantly. And he is buried at the Bretteville
Yes.
sur Levee.
Sur-Lez, yes,
Yeah, exactly. And he was 31, and so he left behind a young wife and a little girl. And then we actually have a very interesting one, too. This is Cook George Fish.
Yes.
Now, George Fish he was born in London, immigrated with his family over to Canada, and ended up in Grand Prairie. And, of course, there was that lure again of, $10 you get some homestead land. Unfortunately, the land George had taken was on the banks of the Smoky River, and I think there was more over the river than what there was on.
You couldn't farm it, that's for sure.
What there was on top,
Oh,
so
my. Oh, my.
he ended up just getting rid of that one and moving across the river. But in the meantime, he decided to enlist in the war as well. And, of course, these are landlocked facilities that they actually do their training in. I know, because I even had somebody ask me, and they said, well, how do you, in Alberta, I mean, we have...
Yeah, there's no Navy in Alberta.
That's right, hey?
Yeah.
And so then he was stationed on the HMS Cherbourg, if I'm pronouncing
Cherbourg, yes.
Cherbourg.
Yes,
I got to
yeah.
get my accent right, yes. And so he was assigned to the Mid-Ocean Escort Force.
Yes.
And on his second trip back from England to Canada, the ship was hit by a torpedo, and 7 men lost their lives that day, of which he was one. So he's commemorated on the Halifax Memorial,
Okay. Yeah.
and he was 37. Now, another little interesting tidbit about Mr. George Fish was that when I was going through his service file, it appeared to me that he had never, or his family had never received the Atlantic Star. And by my calculation, it was deserved.
You merited it, yeah.
Yeah. So, and of course, I wrote and found out when they actually went back through it and they checked it. They said, yes, it got missed for whatever reason.
yeah.
So they sent it out. And it was interesting the day that I picked up the medal at a post office. I had my grandson with me. I think he was about 10 at the time. And he says, Grandma, can you get me one of those too? That sure is nice.
Yeah, exactly. If only, yeah.
Yes.
So what you're saying too then is when these guys come back, those that survive and come back, what did the Legion provide as backup for these guys that came back? Like if they had accidents or if their farm wasn't turning out?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is one thing about Besançon, that they certainly believe in looking after their veterans and their veterans' families. So we've had two quite monumental things that had happened. Now, the one was Private Archie Delaney.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yes, I've heard of him, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And he had a farm in an area of Besançon known as Cluskin Hills.
Okay. Right.
Now, that area up there can be really quite hilly at part. And what had happened with him when he was out doing his farming, the tractor rolled over, no cabs in those days.
Yeah,
so
right.
he succumbed to his injuries then 6 days later, and he passed away. So what happens then, the neighbors, there was three that had these large combines. 3 of them pulled in the yard. They did all the combining for him. And then the Legion actually organized, there were 17 tractors showing up to do all the falls work.
Them. Good for them.
And so that was all done. So we're, trying to basically look after the widow and the young children.
Yeah.
Now, his wife Alice was actually a war bride.
Oh, wow.
And she was a nurse by profession, but she of course had made some friends and what have you. But it's not the same as having your own family there when something like this happens. But what she had decided is that there was no way that she could actually operate this farm on her own.
Right.
She thought, if I move to town, and then I will be able to upgrade my nursing and get back into that profession again. So as soon as our West Smoky Legion heard that she was planning on moving to town, well, they decided they were going to build a house for her.
What do you know?
Isn't that something?
something?
A house complete with a basement? Yes, it was. And of course, there was others beside the Legion members too. Any neighbors or family. Delaney's do have quite a few relatives. And I mean, they did everything from the plumbing to the electrical to, of course, all of the carpentry work. And it was actually warranted. It was large enough that it warranted an article in the Herald Tribune.
Oh, there you go.
And it said 100 willing hands assist, yes. Yeah. So all of that, and she moved into her new house just before Christmas of 1955. So
Wow. So word of mouth through all the Legion network and the headquarters and the different halls, the huts as they called them.
Yes.
Which was the name they gave those places overseas, was Catholic Army Hut or Beaver Hut.
Oh, see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a nickname. Yeah, originally, believe it or not, Canadians brought their national architecture with them, which was the tar paper shack, right? But they built them big enough to have 100 men in them, and they had a kitchen, and they would have concerts and stuff, and they would have them organized. There was a YMCA hut, a Catholic Army hut, a Salvation Army hut, and a Beaver hut. Even when they were in hotels, and they were often called huts. And just like today, soldiers often call their quarters shacks, right? It's that kind of diminutive, but it does mean that often when people are talking in those places, word gets around that somebody needs something. Oh, and that's obviously what happened here. Right?
Oh, totally, yeah. And especially when there's a tragedy, something so tragic like that, you just. The news travels very fast.
It doesn't seem fair. You've gone through the war, exposed yourself to combat.
Exactly.
Yeah, or like Cook, or Fish, who was on the ship, that was sunk at sea.
Yes.
He's a drylander. He trained at Nonsuch in Edmonton, which is a dry land base, right?
Yeah.
But you go to sea and you're keeping the food lines and supplies going to Britain, keeping them in the war. Yeah. And then here he is in the galley, which is a hard place to get out of when you're torpedoed.
I bet you it would be.
Yeah, and so for him, it's it's a tragedy that he's gone and no one will ever see him again. You know, even a headstone.
Oh,
You know, and so those are the guys that often I know in our community they chat a bit about them sometimes, talk back and forth, even at our kitchen table.
Right.
You know, guys that didn't come back. And I'm sure that in the Legion that could lead to some people saying, well, let's get up and do something. You know?
Oh, immediately, as soon as they hear that, Duff, it's just, well, you know, I'll get everybody from this end, you get everybody from that end, and we're taking our tractors up there, we're gonna
Yeah.
get this done, you know?
Right.
And then we had another one in another farm accident in 1958, and I remember this one, Duff, just like it was yesterday, probably because it happened only a mile from home. And Private Lance Corporal Vernon, he went by Bud Patterson. He was out getting the hay up for his livestock and what have you. And of course, must have been, you know, getting along to supper time. Things were getting a little tough, and it plugged up. And he was in a bit of a hurry, you know. And this is how farm accidents happen. I'm sure you're in a bit of a hurry. And he didn't shut the tractor off before he went out to detangle the hay baler, and his arm got caught in the baler. And yes, and when they found him, he was gone. But he actually had wrote a little letter home to his wife that I thought was kind of charming. And so he wrote this letter home on October the 5th of 1945. My dearest wife and son, I am fine, but getting terribly anxious for the day to come home to my darling family. So you were really disappointed in that photo I sent you. Well, it's just this way. I have changed and aged considerably this last 3 years, and I did not want you to give you a shock all at once, with you still thinking that you had a young, good-looking husband.
Yeah, right. Tongue in cheek there.
Yeah, exactly. So those were definitely two of the biggest ones from our
kidding.
area. That's
So
for sure.
you remember their service overseas, but we're actually talking about the Legion providing a lasting memory of their contribution to veterans who've come home and had unfortunate events occur. You know, and I think that's where that comradeship has practical feet and hands when there's a need at home too.
Oh,
so the
absolutely.
service aspect, you know, extends to veterans, to youth in the educational side, but
Yes.
also the athletic side
Yes.
with the track and field events and everything
Yes.
else. So we're talking about a community that has, you might call a whole of community. We say
Yes.
whole of government now. Whole of community contribution, universal contribution wherever service could be given.
Yes.
You know, and so the challenge often would be, can we get that ethic of service conveyed to younger people now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, do you have like a junior Legion membership, or are youth invited to things? Or
Well, one of the things that we have in mind, Duff, when we get our kitchen renovated.
Yes.
And so after we have that, what we want to do is start up a few simple little things like maybe some junior darts.
Yes.
You know, and another thing, I don't know about you, but I don't find kids play cards anymore. We thought we would teach them how to play crib.
Yeah.
And so some little things like that,
Yeah.
that is very interactive, you know,
Yeah.
like I don't want them sitting playing, you know, the
Video games.
all the time. We need to
sure.
have some interaction here. And then, of course, in our Legion, the one wall, we say it's our wall of remembrance. So this had started back in the 80s. We had a local couple, Allie and Earl Wieger. They decided to take it upon themselves and see if they could find pictures of all of the veterans
yes.
that had enlisted in World
Good.
War I, II, and Korea from our
Yeah.
area. There's 158 of them, Doug,
exactly.
you know?
Yes.
So this has been ongoing. So when the kids come, you know, they can look at these pictures and find their relatives there.
Yes,
And
exactly.
And then on the other side of the Legion, we have our ones that we partnered with Canadian Fallen Heroes.
Yep.
So we have all
Great.
those memorials.
Excellent.
And we certainly talk about to the kids when they come, to the youth, all about those things.
Putting a face with a name is so important. You
Oh,
know.
it is, absolutely. Like I had, when we did our Fallen Heroes presentation in 2019, I actually had the great-grandson of it was Charles Dorscheid, in fact.
Oh, wow.
And he came up to me and he was so moved by the presentation that the following year, he's actually planning a trip over to France to see his
see the-
great-grandfather's grave.
See the
So
grave,
I
yeah.
really think it did make an impression,
Yep.
and it made people stop and think a little bit, you know, of what is going on.
Well, that's it. The Legion, as you're describing it, is a place where you have group commemoration, group comradeship, but the individual always counts too.
Oh,
The individual
absolutely.
singled out and commemorated and
Yes.
remembered. You're not just a name or a face,
Because what I find, I mean, they all have one basic thing is that, they felt patriotic enough that they had to go enlist.
Yeah.
But each one of them has a different story, Duff, is what
Yeah.
I just found so interesting when I was doing all these biographies. And some of them, were a little bit sad. There was one, he was actually, and to me he would be very important, he was an instructor for the Air Force pilots down east on the coast somewhere. But he was so embarrassed by his service because he didn't actually get to go overseas and participate. And I'm saying to his granddaughter, I'm saying, my goodness, but what a job he did. So these men actually went trained and didn't go over there blindly,
Yes.
But he never saw it at that.
No, there's a book called Behind the Glory,
Okay.
which is a description of the training command and a number of pilots. Often the first pilots were the ones with a bit of experience as bush pilots who
Right.
trained the first group and then weren't allowed to go themselves.
Right.
And really struggled with that frustration that,
Yeah.
they didn't count their training service as being the same.
Yeah.
But without that, the British Commonwealth Training Program, which we were part of, wouldn't have been able to train the 33,000 air crew that we did.
Right.
Now, what about Korea?
Yes, well, it was really quite interesting because I'm sure you've heard of this. It's called the Military Service Recognition Book.
Yeah.
That's put out by the Alberta Northwest Territories
Right.
Command annually. And I thought, okay, we have all of these with the Canadian Fallen Heroes, our KIAs. What about this other 158 that we have on the wall? So then I took that upon myself that I actually researched all of it because a lot of them left the area.
Yeah, that's right.
When they returned,
Yes.
they spread out. They went down to the States, So, and this was a project that had originally been taken over as far as pictures goes by the Uyghurs back in the 80s. But they were, can you imagine searching all these people down before social media? It would have been horrendous. So we decided to take it one step further, see if we could find the pictures for the remaining ones, do biographies,
right.
so we could have all of these men in this military service
Well,
recognition.
the story, the old World War I song was how are you going to keep the boys down on the farm after they've seen Paris, right?
Right.
Well, for a lot of the guys after World War II, they come back and, farm, but I've now flown planes,
Right.
I've handled heavy trucking,
Yeah.
I've been to sea, and where the occupation, Air
Right.
Canada can only take up so many pilots or Canadian Pacific,
Right.
so off they go to the rest of the world. And you'll find Canadians all around the world doing all kinds of exotic things, but not back in the peace country,
Oh, yes, yes.
it's true.
I was just absolutely amazed by the stories, like I say, this patriotism as far as enlisting, but then their background stories were, and some of them are really quite sad too, things that have happened to them. But so I have all that done. That took 3 winters to get all that done. So all of them from our area are actually in that book.
Good for you.
But when I was actually doing the research, then I came across, unfortunately, I didn't know too much about the Korean War. So I had to do some research on that. And I found out that we had 3 from our area that actually had served in Korea. But there was actually 2 medals.
Yeah.
But you had to apply for them, which
Yes.
I thought was really
that
was really quite interesting because would they do it themselves? 9 times out of 10, no. Sometimes maybe the family would do it, sometimes, but more than likely, no. So for these 3, their families hadn't applied for them.
wow.
So I'm always of the opinion these men earned these, and we're going to get them for them.
right,
So
right.
so absolutely we did, and then we held a little event to
for
present
you.
these 2 medals. One was a peacekeeping medal,
Yep.
and the other one was the voluntary service
Yeah,
medal.
medal, yeah.
To Master Warrant Officer Stanley Hansen. We had Gunner George Burrows, who actually served in 2, and we had John, who went by Jack Dreyer.
Dreyer, yes,
Yeah.
that's the other one.
Yeah.
Yes, he had that he was here.
So it was, and in fact, with Jack Dreyer's widow, she says, Wanda, I don't know what's happened to his medals. We've moved a few times, blah, blah, blah. And I said, did you check with the family, whatever? Yep, nobody has them. So we actually got them reissued for her.
Good for you.
And she still has his tunic. Is that what you call
Yep,
it? Yeah, the
yep.
tunic. So she pinned the medals on and she took a picture, sent it to us. It
great.
was just very heartwarming, that's for sure. So
Well, a lot of the veterans don't want to play up what they did over there.
totally they
There's
don't.
a lot of
Yeah.
general play down the decorations or the gongs, as they often call them.
Yeah.
But for the family, they're sources of pride. But
Absolutely.
they don't always know how they were earned, and sometimes the trauma and what went on to earn them,
Yes, totally.
And most veterans will tell you that for every medal, someone who got a medal, there was somebody else who wasn't noticed, who earned one, deserved one.
Yes,
Too.
Oh, I totally believe that would have happened, Just if you're reading any of the war diaries or anything, you just...
Now, did these Korean vets, did they come to the Legion?
Well, there was only one that is still living, and that was Stanley Hansen. However, he's in one of those continuing care places in
right,
Edmonton. Couldn't
okay,
make it, but
right.
he has a nephew that lived here, so the
Okay,
nephew came,
right,
and
the
the
family.
nephew was so proud. It was, it was really remarkable that how, you could just tell, how much this meant to them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
so we had a little afternoon, and then of
that's
course we had
great.
refreshments and some desserts and things. Yes.
Great, great. So the West Smoky has really put a lot of energy into commemorating the men. What about the women?
Well, absolutely, and this is one thing that you had just mentioned as well too, Duff. In World War I, it was just the nurses, and World War II, the women actually then, and we really had quite a remarkable lady from our area who had decided that she was going to join the Air Force, the Royal Canadian
right.
Air Force, the Women's Division. She was actually born in the Sexsmith area, had moved to a little area called Twilight, and where she was actually really well known for being a ball player. And then she decided that she was going to join, and she actually, the Jerichos, she played on the Jerichos ball team as their prize back catcher. But she was really quite an adventurous lady. She had actually handled airplane parts, the new parts and the ones that needed to repair, that was her job. But she was really quite adventurous coming from a rural area. On one leave, she decided that she was going to hitchhike all the way down the coast of the Pacific, all the way down to Mexico.
Okay.
And then she came all the way back up through Arizona and what have you. Got back to Calgary just in time to get her discharge paperwork. So she's home and she's trying to decide, what am I going to do now that I've had what I really have felt like was a very important job? What am I going to do? So what does she do? She forms the first owned and operated woman's taxi in the Dominion, if you can imagine. Yes.
Good for her.
And in fact, there was an article was written upon her in, I think it's called The Maple Leaf. It's something that's published in London. Yep. It was such a big deal. It even warranted being published over there, you know.
I'll bet.
And, and another thing, she had picked up this young serviceman by the name of Roger LaValle, and then all of a sudden it seems like wherever he needed to go, whether it was 10 steps away, he'd be waiting for the specific cab which she was driving.
Right, okay, yeah.
So they ended up marrying. They had a family of 8 children.
Wow,
and
8
children, yeah, and they had a cattle operation out in the Besançon area.
Right.
So,
Well,
she was on the executive of West Smoky Legion for years and years.
Okay, right.
Yeah, she was very into Legions, that's for sure.
Fascinating. I mean, what you're talking about, here's someone who couldn't just settle down.
No.
Had to be up and doing something.
Well, absolutely. And, it really was important to get these parts, these airplane parts.
And in public life with the cab company,
yes,
too.
Yes.
Now, we shouldn't say that any woman who is not, no one on a farm is settled down. Every wife or woman on a farm is busy.
Oh, totally.
And often handling challenges that at first the war brides and others could never have fathomed, right?
Yes.
But did the Legion bring in the wives to the war brides and others and incorporate them? Do you know?
Well, I don't know as far as the war brides, but I had done some research on them too when I was doing I thought, well, isn't this interesting? There's so many of these men brought home war brides, And there was one still living, but at that time she was in a continuing care place too, so she wasn't well enough for me to actually interview her. But her daughter just gave me this glowing reports because she had came from, I guess you would call it middle class,
right?
Middle class living, and then you come over here where there's no running water.
Surprise!
You go outside to the bathroom.
Yep.
You scrub on the good old scrub board,
Yeah.
So I tell you, these women, they were tough women.
Pretty resourceful.
Absolutely, that's for sure. And they were going to succeed, Yeah, so those men were very lucky to have them. That's for sure.
So here are community builders that are anchored in some way with the Legion or connected in some way with the Legion, which could be support group, could be, a community organization for their children even in athletics or in school. Now, I think what you're saying, though, is if we go to any of these Legions that we've discussed today and you're able to get in, you're going to see pictures and stories of individuals who served, right?
Yes.
Now, obviously, West Smoky has a gallery of photographs. I think these other places must do the same thing. The commemoration, now can people just kind of walk up and go into a Legion, or how do you get in to see the displays that are there?
Well, mostly in the smaller areas because we're so short of volunteers. You just make a call and there'll be one of us. We'll meet you down there.
Okay.
So, if you live in Grand Prairie, you call us from there. We'll be up there before you are. You
Yeah.
get out there and we love to show it off and we love
Right.
to tell the stories. And we just think the Legions are just absolutely wonderful. Not only how we try to assist the veterans and their families, but how we're trying to educate. the
Centers of
youth as well.
memory. Yeah, I mean, they're a war memorial of another kind.
Yes.
A little less sterile, perhaps, or a little less distant feeling from the cenotaph.
Yes.
But another kind of living memorial, you might say,
Yeah.
a heritage site that continues to contribute
Yes.
to the community as it goes along. So you've done a tremendous job of keeping track of all this.
We have, and I think we owe this to them. There's they have given us what I call a gift, and it's probably the greatest gift of all is enjoying life as we know it. So, and so to me, it's time now to honor our veterans fully.
So now I'm going to read something you wrote.
Okay.
Even with what's happening currently in the Ukraine, Israel, and other troubled spots around the world, and many other countries involved in civil wars in 2023, it's easy for us in Canada to be complacent. We live in a fireproof house, as people used to say, because of the oceans and everything.
Right.
And yet, one of the things we've noticed about the peace country is it's plugged in to the rest of the world.
Right.
And people go out from the peace to be involved. And one of the things we've contributed is military people as peacekeepers since the wars,
Yes.
but also people who've been involved in diplomacy or mission work. And in many ways, the Legion remains a vital pipeline or conduit of world affairs and world involvement
Absolutely.
that our local people have been involved in, and bring back their stories when they come home, if they come home. It means that out of the 158 Canadian soldiers who lost their lives from here, in Afghanistan, for example, there were 550 Canadians who died in Korea, that we remember them as part of the commemoration at November the 11th, but also we remember them as part of that heritage that goes back to World War I and II.
Absolutely.
And we see commemorated, immortalized, you might say, in the
Yeah.
legions. So Canada's commitment now to peace and international peace, which has involved 125,000 peacekeepers since that began in the 1950s, kind of reminds us that the Legion remembers them. They're veterans for veterans, but they're also veterans for peace. And they're a place that we can remember as a living commemoration,
Right.
or a social commemoration that still serves. I mean, the interesting thing about military service, we thank them for their service, but we forget that through the Legion, sometimes the service continues
Right.
as an ongoing commitment to the peace country. And their stories are certainly vital in a living
Right.
sense. So you come from a family steeped in military history. You have a great uncle who was killed, buried in Belgium.
Yes. Yep.
Two other great uncles, one of whom spent 3.5 years in a prisoner of war camp. It's
Yeah.
another story in Germany. And a grandfather who served in World War I. Your own father served in World War II. You're reminded by family, but you're reminded by your contribution to Legion. And so for us all who drive by a Legion, notice it maybe, or maybe we will pay more attention to see where they are now.
Right.
For those of us who have heard what you've been talking about today, there's a story there for each of us, whether we have a relative involved or not. Is a story for each of us to touch bases with and maybe to watch for, and maybe to even consider joining and being a part of.
That would be wonderful.
That's right. So that's a contribution we don't want to forget. We talk about the soldiers, but there's also the people who served at home. And that's
Absolutely.
another story of the peace we wanted to commemorate today. So thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Okay, right.
All
Well,
right.
that's it. So thank you all, and we'll see you again.
Bye for now.
Thank you for tuning in to the PCHS podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you are notified when we release new episodes. To learn more about the Peace Country Historical Society, visit our website, pc-hs.ca.